both of them are really the experts on the topic. So right now we are going to move on to their presentation. I think each of the presenters have about 15 to 20 minutes, and then after that we can open the floor and begin our discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcome Michael first.
Thank you, Vice President Liu, Dr. Liu. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's always an honor, a pleasure to be here and have occasion to share some of my views. First off, I would like to congratulate President Liao and Vice President Liu on their recent appointment at TFD. You had a chance to continue very important work that TFD has been doing over the years. I'm very happy to see that you're in charge now. Very good. I also would like to point out that it was Dr. Liu's birthday yesterday. I think he's turning, happy belated birthday. I think you're turning 28, right? Your birthday, okay. And happy birthday. Okay, having said this, it's always a challenge to address this subject in 15 to 20 minutes. I always tell people in the audience, throw something at me if I go beyond 20 minutes, because I could go on for the entire morning. A lot has been said about authoritarian influence over the years and the toolkits that they are using to try to undermine our democratic institutions. So I felt that it's a little bit difficult to find something new to talk about, and I don't want to regurgitate what every other expert has said on the subject over the past few years. So we need a fresh angle, and I think it's important to have fresh angles because we don't want to constantly think along the same lines, because our opponents are constantly changing their strategies as well. So they are trying to find ways to penetrate our societies. First off, it's very important to remember as well that when we talk about political warfare or sharp power, or however you name it, this is not something that Beijing, that Moscow, and other authoritarian regimes are only doing in times of war or in times of conflict. For them, this is a continuum. They're always doing it, and they dial up or down as needed. They're always on the lookout for opportunities to penetrate our societies and to weaken and undermine and erode our democratic institutions. So even at times when relations seem to be going well, and we certainly saw that in the Taiwan Strait a few years ago, that does not mean that the authoritarian side is ceasing its activities to try to undermine institutions. Quite the opposite. It uses that peacetime, if you will, to install elements and tools on the ground so that when tensions arise again, they have the means by which to further their political ambitions. So it's very important to realize that this is a spectrum. They're always their mindset. We're always in wartime. No doubt we are currently dealing with what I would call an axis of authoritarianism. So again, with China and Russia as the leaders, but more and more a number of other non-democratic countries bandwagoning and trying to find strength in numbers. So among them, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, Belarus, Hungary, Serbia, are all countries that are also benefiting from the activities that regimes in Beijing and Moscow have been doing in recent years. They certainly don't have the capacity that these two countries have to undermine our institutions, but by bandwagoning, by joining force as part of that axis, they're able to achieve a little bit more than they would if they were doing that on their own. So we keep talking about the democratic camp, but also we need to realize that there's an axis of authoritarians that also is consolidating and more working together as well as opportunities arise. So Moscow and the CCP primarily are seeking to overthrow or overturn the world order that has prevailed since the conclusion of World War II in 1945. And they are also seeking to empower other autocratic allies to try to overwhelm us and to distract us and to overstretch us. And by weakening us, they can further advance their own ambitions. These regimes are sharing the tools, they're sharing the technology, and they're sharing the lessons learned with those smaller autocratic countries so that they can also further their ambitions. They're also providing political cover at institutions like United Nations through votes at UN General Assembly and others. They're also providing support and backing for regimes that are also violating the rules as we know them. For them, it's very clear that the status quo, so the order that has prevailed since the end of World War II, is no longer acceptable, it's no longer tenable, and they are on the offensive. On the other hand, the Democratic camp wants to maintain the status quo. So there's a little bit of an asymmetry in the will to do things. We're playing defensive, they're playing offensive. So that also puts us at a disadvantage because there is not that urge, there is not that drive that you would find in a constellation of countries that are seeking to break things, to undermine the world order. So they have more, I would argue they have greater commitment than we do in that battle, that clash of ideologies, or that new Cold War that we're currently engaged in. So what the tools that authoritarians have in common is their exploitation of our own vulnerabilities. And this is the area today that I would like to focus on, and I think is the fresh angle that might be beneficial to our conversation on the issue. If we don't recognize that we have weaknesses, foibles, vulnerabilities, we will not be in a good position to seek to counter the detrimental effects of authoritarian influence in our own societies and institutions. So we need an honest accounting of our own weaknesses and our own blind spots. So today I'd like to talk about two, what I would say, key weaknesses that have undermined our ability to counter that threat from authoritarian regimes, but also two key vulnerabilities that authoritarian regimes are exploiting and are seeking to exploit in their efforts. So the first one is division, polarization in our own societies. And the second one, I was struggling for terms, but I'm calling it the dysfunctional democratic camp. And you'll see what I mean when I talk about that later on. So the first weakness, so divisions and polarization. Democracies, there's no surprise here, are increasingly polarized. We're seeing this in the United States, we're seeing this across Europe, we're seeing this in my home country in Canada, and we are unfortunately seeing this here in Taiwan as well. Citing the political scientist, historian Timothy Schneider, a few years ago in one of his books, he said that the greatest threat to democracies is when political parties start regarding other parties within their country as the main enemy, more so than the country or party that represents the existential threats to the country. So to use the example of Taiwan, for example, the Greens and the Blues regard themselves oftentimes as the greatest enemy, and the CCP from outside benefits from that, and I'll get into that in greater detail. So these divisions, that high polarization, creates opportunities for exploitation by authoritarian regimes from the outside. And for them, what they seek to accomplish is to use an array of instruments to amplify that polarization within the targeted society. So they will use any issue. It does not even have to be about the main political objectives of that country. So they can target that targeted society with issues like COVID vaccines, access to products, food products. They can talk about Brexit. They can talk about the elections right now in the United States. Even issues like LGBT, even issues like transgender issues. If you live in Taiwan recently, there's been battles online on that very issue. These are all the kinds of things that, particularly thanks to social media, keep us divided. And it consolidates camps, it distracts people from what the real existential issues are, and that in turn creates openings for exploitation by authoritarian regimes working from the outside or their proxies within the country. So that exploitation of polarization consolidates, it hardens camps, it undermines social cohesion, and weakens our ability to unite in the defense of our countries and democratic institutions. So in that particular game, or in that strategy, the external authoritarian regime also relies upon what we call proxies. So those are co-opted individuals, institutions, whose main role it is to amplify, to assist the external activities of the authoritarian regime. So co-optation is one, I would say, one of the principal instruments in the authoritarian toolkit as they seek to undermine our societies and advance their own interests. So co-optation occurs at different levels. It can be politicians, it could be current, it could be former, it could be heads of state, current or former, it could be entertainers, it could be academics, and it could be, I hate that term, but influencers. So the people on YouTube, I don't use a lot of social media, so I can't name them all, but YouTube, TikTok, Little Red Book, Instagram, Facebook, you name it. There's a lot of activity going there, and that has been seized upon by authoritarian regimes as well in recent years. I will use one recent example of the uses by authoritarian regimes of influencers and proxies, and that would be the days or the week leading up to the Joint Sword 2024B military exercises that China held around Taiwan a couple of days ago. What we saw is from politicians, current and former, and artists who work in China, creating or shaping the informational environment in a way that suggested that China had no choice but to respond to a provocation from Taiwan. And by creating that image, you have an authoritarian regime that is using a Coast Guard, a militarized Coast Guard, and the armed forces to threaten the democracy over something that actually never happened. You had a number of voices saying that President Lai Ching-te had somehow failed to reach out in response to an olive branch that had been extended by Beijing ahead of the Double 10 national holiday. A lot of us who watch these things very closely were looking for that so-called olive branch, and we have no idea what it was. We don't know what the said olive branch was, and in reality, there wasn't one. And yet, you had a constellation of influencers on social media who tried to create the impression that it was Taiwan that provoked those military drills. So these are one thing. If you're not based in Taiwan, you're not paying attention, and you live overseas and only pay passing attention to what's going on in the Taiwan Strait, chances are you're going to conclude, yes, Taiwan must be to blame. It's probably President Lai who's to blame for China that had no choice but to respond militarily to some sort of provocation. So this is one area where I think influencers can really shape the discourse, the environment, in favor of authoritarian designs. But you also have proxies that do not generate disinformation or misinformation or narratives, but simply are amplifying divisions that already exist within societies. So not every person who says things about the DPP government is necessarily a China proxy. In reality, most of them probably are not, and most opposition parties are not China proxies. But by further consolidating the divisions, by themselves using disinformation, they are making the life of authoritarian regimes, in this case Beijing, easier because they themselves are consolidating polarization in Taiwan, and they are creating new issues that can also be exploited by content farms, by social media under CCP control, the PLA and whatnot. So when you combine these two, so you have these divisions that are not ideologically aligned with the CCP, in Taiwan's case, and the proxies, then what you're seeing is an environment that is very, very conducive to the weakening of society, and that certainly helps regimes like the CCP to advance their interests within Taiwan, and weakens their ability to deal with the existential threats. Moving on, the second existential weakness is the dysfunctional democratic camp. So by this I mean, and again, up until recently, I also led the program at the International Republican Institute on countering foreign authoritarian influence. And I had a chance to travel to many countries and work with several partners, some of whom are here today. So that gave me, I think, important insights into how the democratic camp is seeking to respond to the threat posed to our institutions and democracy by authoritarian regimes. And I think it helped me identify areas where there might be some dysfunctionalities and weaknesses that we really need to think about. Because if we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, I maintain that we would be at a serious disadvantage. So for one thing, I would say that there's a certain lack of urgency, I would argue, in the capitals of the countries that are providing most of the funding for the countering work that is being done globally. And the reason for this is that, again, speaking for myself, I've lived here in Taiwan for almost 19 years now. It is a lived reality. We are a frontline state. On a daily basis now, we see what the Chinese military is doing to threaten us, but we also experience the different means by which China uses political warfare to undermine our institutions. So for us, it's very easy, especially people like the people in the room today, we live that, that's a part of our work. This is a lived experience. This is something that is real, that is concrete, that we experience on a daily basis. For people overseas, they don't necessarily live, I mean, if you live in Ukraine, obviously it's a lived experience as well, but if you're in Washington, D.C., there is no sense of urgency. No one threatens to invade them tomorrow. So I think already in terms of mindset, that creates certain problems. I would argue as well, and I'm not here to name names of organizations, but I would argue that the main ones have probably gotten too big over the years. Some of them are decades old. They may have ossified a little bit. From my experience, some of them are quasi-governmental now, and with that comes a lot of red tape and all sorts of levels of approval that need to be done and things that need to be checked and cross-checked and evaluated and blah, 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 before you can actually release the money so that you can take the kind of action that is necessary to deal with the issues. That slows everything down. It probably also discourages some people on the front lines who would like to be a little bit more, to be more proactive. And I think, again, that puts us at a disadvantage because it creates an asymmetry. Because I doubt that if you work in United Front Work Department in China or the equivalent in Russia and you want to start doing operations in the targeted country, that you have to go through all these levels of approval before you can get the funding to do what you're supposed to be doing in that country. That goes back to my original point. There is an asymmetry of commitment and sense of urgency between the democratic camp and the autocratic regimes that we are fighting. I've seen a lot of overlap as well. It's become a cool thing now to work on authoritarian influence. There's been an explosion of organizations in recent years whose main mandate is to work on those areas, but the amount of funding available for these things remains limited. So now, rather than having 15 organizations doing that, you have 200 organizations doing that, all vying for the same pot of money. And what we're seeing as well is that Organization X, Organization Y, or Organization Z, they're all pretty much doing the same thing. There's a lot of overlap, and I've noticed a lack of strategic thinking and coordination that would allow us to really, get the most bang for the buck when it comes to these operations as well. So there's a lot of competition for money, but competition for access. For doing things, and oftentimes when they do things in different countries, the partners are the same as well. So I think more coordination would be useful in that regard as well. There's a lack of prioritization in that whole exercise and that whole endeavor as well. I would argue that given that we have finite, limited resources, we should really focus our interests on areas, parts of the world, countries where we can actually make a difference in countering authoritarian influence. I have absolutely nothing against Africa or the global south, absolutely not, but I think there are areas where the battle is not worth it. If we had all the money in the world, we could focus on those areas, but especially Africa, and it's of our own doing as well. The West, for so many years, abused and ignored the African continent, but then countries like China, particularly, seized that opportunity. They brought tons of money in infrastructure investment and whatnot. we're too late. We're too late and we don't have the capacity to do everything. So rather than to spread out all that money and capacity, we should really focus on the areas of the world where we can make a difference and start there and then see, the kind of outcomes that we're getting and build upon that. So I will probably end here because it feels like I've already reached my 20 minutes, but certainly happy to discuss more means by which we can resolve those challenges as well during the Q&A. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Michael, for your very insightful and very informative analysis. Thank you very much. And now let's turn the table to Dr. Wang. Dr. Wang, please.
I want to share with you some pictures, so that's the reason I have the PowerPoint slide, so hopefully you can see it more clearly. Okay, so people know me as a guy studying religion. So, so people are expecting me to talk about Mazu, talk about Catholicism, talk about the Christianity in China, talk about the religious repression. But today I will talk about a little different, but still I will use an example from religion. So I got a many phone call, asked me to comment on the Li Zhang has been invited to travel to China before the presidential election, talk about the Mazu pilgrimage. Other folk religion in Taiwan were invited by Chinese authority to visit China, and many people call this Yuan Fang, right? Many people call this infiltration. Many people call this I want to second Michael just mentioned. This is one of the areas, right? We have the vulnerability because people have very different ideas, people have different identities, people doing many different things. Some of those things will be utilized by the Chinese authority to divide and to weaken our society. So that definitely is an issue. So today we're talking about the part of the solution, talk about my idea about solution. And I want to break it in advance, saying, well, my solution is more focusing on the civil society. And I'm very happy to know that we have the Mongolia Women Funds people, and we have the Freedom House people. I just visited Mongolia in June, and also the Freedom House in last month. So I believe civil society is the solution because we have such a diverse group of people. We have very different values, we have very different ideology, we have very different identity. But that's a good thing. Well, I will talk about why that's a good thing later, but just bear with me. So also bear with me, I have to talk a little bit about the literature because I think most of the current solution we have are in the literature, right? We have basically three groups. So the 在地协力者, right? The local collaborators or the influencers, right? Just Michael just mentioned, the people or the proxies, right? People getting money, getting some benefit from the Chinese authorities, so they become the danger to our total democratic society. And the second group will be talking about the sharp power, right? So we have many writers, we have many scholars talking about how China used the civil society organization, like the Institute of the 孔子学院, the Confucius Institute, as a means to infiltrate the democratic society. And that lately I have my work with Gary. We talk about the Great United Front work, the 大统战. I talk about especially the religion become the channel for infiltrate the democratic society. And also lately we have many other incidents, right, from Ukraine war, from Xinjiang, from Hong Kong to Taiwan. We talk about the information and disinformation, right, used by the authority, also the cyber attacks, the great propaganda, the 大外宣, right? All those incidents, those cases, all remind us that, right, we are facing the real challenge and also the danger, not just from across the street, but also inside our own society. But before we talk about solution, or my idea about solution, but I talk about two very interesting pictures. You can see just last year. So last year, one of the very famous Taiwanese Buddhist master, Xing Yun, passed away. And the night he passed away, there's a blog post by Ye Xiaowen in China. And if you know about religion, you know Ye Xiaowen is like he used to be the president of the SARA and also the deputy director of the 统战部, the 中央统战部. So you know he is the top person in charge of all those religious policy as well as those religious persecutions. So, but this guy, right, from the atheist Chinese Communist Party, in charge of religious policy, playing cello. So that's the picture he posts online. Okay, he personally posts online to show his respect and memory of this Taiwanese monk, and saying, well, 蓦然回首，那人却在灯火阑珊处 means I miss you, my friends, even you pass away. So if you know the news about this event, you know later after the death, there's a trouble between Taiwan and China because the Chinese authority want to send a delegate to attend the funeral, but our government say no. So they become a big event and dispute between two sides. Why a Chinese Communist Party member played cello for a Taiwanese monk? Right? Think about that. I think this is very surreal, but also very, very interesting to look at how religion play a role in the cross-strait relations. And that's the second one. That's a few years ago in 2010. That's another top Chinese religious affair officers visit. By the way, that's taken in Taiwan, in Taipei and Kaohsiung. So Wang Zuo'an, the director of the SARA, visit Taipei and meet with two very important figures of the Taiwanese Catholic Church, Hong Shan-chuan and Shan Guoxi. So that's also very severe pictures. If you know about the Vatican-Taiwan relations, you know the breaking of the diplomatic tie is on the table and for many years, and people talk about the timing. So I got a phone call actually from a journalist asking me about, well, were we losing Vatican this year or not? Those kind of questions. So that's also very surreal because we thought, right, the Taiwanese Catholic Church would be thinking, well, this is our potential enemy because they are going to breaking our tie with the Roman Catholic Church to the Pope, right? We are going to losing those traditional, not only the diplomatic tie, but also the tie with the. So by the way, Vatican is our last, right? The last formal diplomatic allies in Europe. So why the Taiwanese Catholic leaders visit, well, taking this picture with the Chinese Religious Affairs Authority, and also from the website, they actually saying this very, very interesting conclusion. He said, well, the director Wang praised the clergy from Taiwan for frequently travel to the mainland to teach and contribute to the training of mainland clergy. Both sides reached a preliminary consensus with the Taiwanese side expressing a welcome and willingness to assist mainland clergy in coming to Taiwan for further study and training. Very interesting, right? So is this a good thing or bad thing? Like the previous one, the Taiwanese Buddhist connection with the Chinese authority. Is it a good thing or bad thing? So I think before we have that conclusion, let me talk about the misunderstanding and the deficiency I see in our leadership, in our current solutions, right? When we talk about the local collaborators, can we say Master Xing Yun or the Cardinal Shan Guoxi, are collaborators? Can we say they are the proxies of the Chinese authority? Probably not, right? So they are from a very powerful Taiwanese religious organization. Let me just be very, very straightforward. They are wealthy. They are very powerful. They are very autonomous, right? They not even listen to our own presidents. So why they will listen to the Chinese authority, right? So I think the local collaborators' thesis is not very sufficient to explain their behavior. Talking about sharp powers. So neither Buddhism or the Catholicism is sharp enough, I also have to say, right? Even they are very autonomous. They listen to no one, but they still not sharp enough to promote any political threat or damages to our democracy, right? People usually, especially if you look into literature, we see they are the very good foundation for our democracy. The great propaganda or the cognitive warfare. So before let's talk, let me ask you, have any one of you heard about those two news? Have you saw those pictures before? Right? So, well, I guess Chinese authority has promoting those events, those news, those collaboration frequently. But apparently they never reach us, right? So nobody knows. We don't know. I guess the Chinese people also don't know about those collaboration and ties and friendships. So if nobody knows about those, we hardly can say they are the great propaganda, right? So what's going on? Do we really understand what the CCP is doing in the civil exchanges and engagement? Do we really know? So what do we need to know about those engagements, right? So I wrote a paper with my student about Mazu pilgrimage. We find out that there is a thing. We shouldn't say this is like the two sides are competing for some kind of political agenda, right? It's more like the continuing process. So they do something, we have the responses, and they do the next, and we do another. So not only about information, that's the point, right? This is not only about information and agency, right? About the person, the masters, the cardinals. We're talking about the whole process, including everyone, right? In Taiwan, in China, in the United States, in Canada, everywhere. So it's about the friends and foes. It's about the Chinese goals is to making a Chinese team, right? Making more and more people to supporting their agenda, or at least, right, not against their agenda. So this is we saw earlier as a transnational, the contentious and dialectic, the battlefield, right, between China and the rest of the world. And also we call this is a delegitimation process. So they are not trying to win the election, right? They're not trying to making, well, let me be really straightforward, like making韓國瑜become the president. Not like that, right? Because they know Taiwanese people will decide who will be the president in Taiwan. And they know even they can buy out few religious leaders, some business tycoon, or few movie stars. But those are not enough, right, to move Taiwanese democracy. So their goal is never to win the election or winning the hearts and minds of Taiwanese people. They are trying to weaken, they are to divide and to making us, right, fighting with each other, making us to criticize, finger pointing at each other. So because we see each other, some are getting a welcome from the Chinese authority, some are travel to China frequently, some are, well, in their birthday party, they have a Chinese officer to play cello for them. So we get angry, right? We saw those pictures, we saw those information, we saw those images, then we get angry and we point finger at each other and we become, like Michael said, we are divided, right? We are polarized. So that's the true danger. And I believe that's the goal, or at least the political goal the Chinese authority can do at this point. And we should be to prevent that to be happening, right? So it's not about who the CCP is talking to. It's all about whom it is not talking to. So he is not talking to is the key, right? Because he tried to divide and making people, okay, because you're not welcome in China. You are our enemy, so you are something and something, and people should be avoiding you, right? We all know China put out very, very straightforward right lines, right? So some certain kind of people or subjects you shouldn't talk about. You are the professors in the university, you shouldn't study, you shouldn't talk about those things, you shouldn't invite the Dalai Lama to your university, so on and so forth, right? We know those right lines. So that's kind of the Chinese thinking, right? They are trying to stop us from making friends to each other. So only friend you can make is to China. So what do we need to understand in CCP's tactics and strategy? Let me back to the topic of this panel, right? So I promote this hybrid influence analytical framework, so 混合式的影响力分析. So because we are not focusing on the information or agency alone, right? The people or individual or even they are the very influential figures. If we only look out at them, that's totally not enough because their attitude, their behavior are just a very small part of the great propaganda or the great uniform work. Very small part. Like Shan Guoxi's shaking hands with Wang Zuo'an. Shan Guoxi definitely is not the core of the Chinese uniform work. But that picture becomes part of the Chinese uniform work, for sure, right? So some people are getting the message that, okay, if I'm doing certain things, if I behave, or not doing certain things, I will get in the same welcoming wagon, right? So I can do those things in China, or at least not be banned by the Chinese authorities. So that's the message, right? We want to stop that kind of message to become influential, right? So that's the paper I published with Michael's organization, Prospect Quarterly, last year. So my view is the danger is this battlefield, right? Including three major parts, right? Our three major part of literatures. Uniform work, the sharp powers, and cognitive warfare. So basically, we talk about the NGOs, the civil society organization, and also the NGO from China, the GANGOs, government organized organizations, plus the information engagement and warfare on the cyberspace, right? NGO, GANGOs, and disinformation all combined become the battlefield we are fighting right now. So yes, the CCP wants us to make the mistake of cracking down on religious freedom, free speech, and other basic human rights in Taiwan. So that is a mistake we have to avoid. We have to insist. That's the basic value we have to insist. Okay, so that's the thing I want to share with you today. Hopefully I give you enough information because I can, like Michael said, we can keep talking for the whole morning because that's our passion and study for many years. So again, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Wang Yun, for sharing your own observation. And I found that very, very interesting in the sense that you provided your observation with the hybrid influence. I think this is the one very worth noting for all of us, because I think for authoritarian regimes around the world, these kind of things would not happen only to Taiwan, but maybe to many of our friends in this room right now. Okay, so let's open the floor. We have about 15 minutes, so please feel free to raise your hand. And if you want to share your comments or raise questions to us, please identify yourself first. Okay, the floor is open. Please, don't be shy. Yes.
Hi, Kevin Slayton. I manage the Freedom House office here in Taiwan. One thing that this conversation is making me think of is an ongoing sort of open and sometimes not open, sort of suppressed, very key question about access, not access, that's not the right word, allowing greater exchange between Chinese and Taiwanese citizens, particularly making it easier for Chinese to come to Taiwan. And I'm really curious what you think about this larger debate given that obviously opens up additional routes to do some of the things, use some of these tactics. But on the flip side, and I realize why you're not talking about the flip side given the topic and time, the flip side is there are benefits for the pro-democracy camp of having access to and relationships with Chinese people. You know, those routes also open up opportunities, not just threats. So is there a way to balance this, particularly in Taiwan, which has the existential consideration that some other democracies don't? Yeah, I'm very curious to know your thoughts on this within this context.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin.
I have to be brief. Well, as a former intelligence officer, obviously I recognize the challenges of opening your doors to people coming from a country that seeks to undermine your existence. The problem right now is that the environment in China has become so repressive under Xi Jinping that there's two things. If the Chinese regime allows certain Chinese individuals to come to Taiwan, there's probably a reason for that. So they're either receiving guidance from the CCP or they're going to be monitored and surveilled against. The other problem as well is if they come to Taiwan and they interact with organizations like TFD or the Taiwanese government and whatnot, chances are those Chinese individuals going back to China, they and their families are going to get into trouble with the CCP. So we don't have the kind of permissive environment in China right now that allows that. I completely understand and agree with your point that the Chinese side, and I would argue the Taiwanese side, would benefit from having greater exchanges. But unless you can do that in a safe environment that on the one hand you're not creating additional risks to Taiwanese society, and that the Chinese partners can do that safely, it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve. But certainly, you know, Taiwan is such an extraordinarily vibrant place. It's hard to imagine that people would come from China and not be impressed with that and not want that for themselves as well. But we just need to find a proper environment in which those types of exchanges can occur, and I don't believe that's possible right now under Xi Jinping.
Thank you, Michael.
That's a good and very hard question. I guess my short answer to that will be just keep the door open as much as we can. And also, I think in this case especially, we need civil society, especially because many Chinese people come to those events will be safer because they are not political, right? Well, apparently they cannot come to this event because the TFD has been banned by the Chinese authority, right? But there are other, if this event will be holding in my university, for example, in Zhendang, that would be a different story, right? The more Chinese scholars and students and others could attend. And that would be an opportunity for us to reach them, also they to contact us, right? And I guess the religious organization as well. So we see, for example, if you look at the Chinese officer who have ever visited Taiwan, the first stop of them will be always like the Muslim temples. Why? Because religious organization become, well, on the flip side, there will be the proxies, right? There will be a proxy for the Chinese United Front war or infiltration, but at the same time, there will be the proxy for us as well. Because we can use those organizations and those non-political events to become the bridge for us and them to be able to keep talking to each other for the better or worse. Yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it is quite important to keep the door open. But I tend to agree with Michael and also Dr. Wang. Under this current circumstances, especially I believe in the case of China, because when we are talking about China's sharp power or fake news, those kind of things, we also need to factor in the current situation in China right now, politically, socially, and economically. We all know that right now maybe China is encountering certain kind of economic challenges in terms of development. So for that, maybe if the top I'm the top leader of China, I would be very cautious about opening up, further opening up. Yeah, just for information. Thank you. Any other comments from our participants? Yes, Gus, please.
Hi. Thank you, Michael, for a very comprehensive and deep analysis of the situation, especially vis-a-vis China, and Professor, for that. My takeaway was this: how religion is being used to divide your own society in the battle between the hearts and minds of Taiwanese. But I was just wondering, the title of your session is about undermining democracy in Asia, and not just in Taiwan, and not just in China. And I was hoping to also hear your perspectives, how it is linked to the trend in the region: Cambodia, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, etc. And how does this place into this whole equation of this big